My parents forced me to drain my entire savings account to pay for my sister's $80,000 dream wedding at the most exclusive venue in town. They smiled smugly as I handed over the check, convinced they had manipulated me perfectly. What they didn't know was that I owned the venue, and I was about to give them the surprise of their lives. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'm Olivia Carter, 29 years old, and I've spent my entire life watching my younger sister Madison get everything she ever wanted while I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. But this time, their manipulation backfired in ways they never could have imagined. The whole mess started 6 months ago when Madison announced her engagement to Trevor, a guy she'd been dating for exactly 8 months. Most people would consider that rushing things, but Madison has never been one to wait for anything she wants. She's always operated under the assumption that the world exists to fulfill her desires, and unfortunately, our parents have spent 25 years proving her right. Madison burst through my apartment door that Tuesday evening without knocking as usual, practically bouncing with excitement. Her engagement ring caught the light as she waved her hand around dramatically. The diamond was enormous, clearly expensive, and, knowing Trevor's entry-level marketing job, probably represented several months of his salary. "Olivia, you'll never guess what happened," she squealed, not waiting for me to respond. "Trevor proposed last night at Sunset Point, and it was absolutely perfect. He got down on one knee right as the sun was setting, and there were rose petals everywhere, and a string quartet playing our song. Can you believe it?" I could believe it, actually, because Madison had been dropping increasingly obvious hints about Sunset Point being the most romantic spot in the city for months. She'd even shown Trevor pictures of elaborate proposals she'd found on Pinterest, complete with detailed breakdowns of what made each one special. The poor guy never had a chance to come up with something original. "Congratulations," I said, genuinely trying to be happy for her despite my reservations about the timeline. "When are you thinking of having the wedding?" Madison's eyes lit up even brighter, if that was possible. "That's the best part. I already found the perfect venue. You know Rosewood Manor, that gorgeous estate on the north side? They had a last-minute cancellation for October, and I convinced them to hold it for me. Can you imagine? Rosewood Manor. It's like a fairy tale come true." My stomach dropped. Rosewood Manor was indeed the most prestigious wedding venue in our city, a sprawling Victorian estate with manicured gardens, crystal chandeliers, and a guest list that typically included politicians, celebrities, and old money families. It was also astronomically expensive, with wedding packages starting at $50,000 and climbing rapidly from there. "Madison, that sounds incredible, but isn't Rosewood Manor a bit ambitious? I mean, the cost alone must be—" She waved her hand dismissively. "Money isn't an issue. Mom and Dad are so excited about the wedding, and they want me to have everything I've ever dreamed of. Besides, Trevor's parents are contributing too. It's going to be absolutely spectacular." I wanted to point out that our parents weren't exactly wealthy. Dad worked as a middle manager at an insurance company, and Mom taught elementary school. They lived comfortably, but certainly didn't have the kind of disposable income required for a Rosewood Manor wedding. However, I'd learned long ago that questioning Madison's plans only led to dramatic scenes and accusations of jealousy. Over the next few weeks, Madison's wedding planning consumed every family conversation. Sunday dinners became detailed discussions of floral arrangements, menu tastings, and dress fittings. She'd selected a color scheme of blush pink and gold, ordered custom invitations with hand calligraphy, and hired a photographer whose portfolio read like a who's who of high society weddings. During one particularly elaborate dinner presentation, Madison spread dozens of photos across our parents' dining room table, each representing a different aspect of her vision. There were images of towering centerpieces with rare orchids, a 10-tier cake decorated with edible pearls, and tablescapes that belonged in architectural magazines. The ceremony will be in the Rose Garden, she explained, pointing to a photo of Rosewood Manor's most photographed location. Then, cocktail hour on the terrace with a jazz trio, followed by dinner in the grand ballroom. We're flying in my flowers from Ecuador because their roses are simply incomparable to anything grown locally. Our mother listened with rapt attention, occasionally gasping at particularly luxurious details. Our father nodded along, though I noticed him checking his phone more frequently as the presentation continued. The numbers Madison was casually mentioning would have made a financial advisor weep. And for the reception, Madison continued, we're having a 12-piece orchestra, a champagne fountain, and a fireworks display to end the evening. Trevor's cousin knows someone who does pyrotechnics for major concerts, so it's going to be absolutely breathtaking. I couldn't help myself. Madison, this all sounds wonderful, but have you actually calculated the total cost? Because from what you're describing, we're talking about… Olivia, our mother interrupted sharply, this is Madison's special day. Money shouldn't be a consideration when it comes to celebrating love. Our father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Well, we do need to be somewhat practical about the budget, but we'll figure it out. Madison deserves to have the wedding of her dreams. That phrase had been the family motto for as long as I could remember. Madison deserves. Madison deserves ballet lessons when I want to play soccer. Madison deserves a new car when mine was perfectly functional. Madison deserves to go to the expensive private college while I worked my way through state school. The pattern was so ingrained that questioning it felt almost revolutionary. After dinner, I cornered our father in his study while Madison showed our mother more photos on her phone. He was staring at his laptop screen with an expression I'd seen before, usually when bills arrived that he hadn't budgeted for. Dad, can I ask you something honestly? How are you planning to pay for all this? He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten I was there. Oh, Olivia, we'll manage. We always do. But Dad, from what Madison's describing, we're talking about $60,000 or $70,000, maybe more. Do you and Mom have that kind of money saved?
His shoulders sagged slightly. Not exactly, no. But this is important, Livy. Madison has been dreaming about her wedding day since she was a little girl. You remember how she used to dress up in your grandmother's old curtains and pretend to walk down the aisle? I did remember, though I also remembered being told I was too practical and unimaginative when I preferred building forts to playing weddings. But I wasn't here to relitigate childhood dynamics. I understand it's important, I said carefully, but what's the actual plan? Are you taking out a loan, using retirement savings? Because if it's putting you and Mom in financial jeopardy… We'll figure it out, he repeated, but his tone suggested the conversation was over. Madison only gets married once, hopefully, and we want to do right by her. Over the following month, I watched my parents transform from excited to increasingly stressed. My mother started working overtime at the school, staying late to tutor students for extra income. My father began taking on weekend consulting projects, something he'd sworn he'd never do after turning 50. Meanwhile, Madison's plans continued to expand. She decided the original guest list of 150 wasn't sufficient and pushed it to 200. She upgraded from the standard dinner package to the premium menu featuring lobster and Wagyu beef. She added a dessert station to complement the elaborate cake, hired a videographer to work alongside the photographer, and booked the venue's bridal suite for a weekend-long celebration. During one family dinner, as Madison excitedly described her latest additions to the wedding plan, I noticed our mother quietly calculating numbers on a napkin. When Madison stepped out to take a call from her wedding planner, Mom showed Dad the napkin. The color drained from his face. "How much?" I asked quietly. Dad cleared his throat. It's more than we initially discussed." "How much more?" "The venue alone is $45,000, Mom said in a whisper, as if saying it quietly would make it less true. That's before flowers, catering upgrades, music, photography, or any of the extras Madison keeps adding. I felt sick. $45,000 for a single day, from parents who clipped coupons and bought generic groceries to make ends meet. You don't have to do this, I said. Madison will understand if you need to scale things back. Both parents looked at me as if I'd suggested canceling Christmas. We can't disappoint her, Mom said firmly. She's already told everyone about Rosewood Manor. All her friends, Trevor's family, everyone at work. We can't ask her to downgrade now. That's when I realized the trap they'd built for themselves. Madison hadn't just planned an expensive wedding, she'd created a public spectacle that would humiliate our parents if they couldn't deliver. And knowing my sister, this was probably intentional. Madison had always been brilliant at backing people into corners where saying no would make them look like the villains. 2 weeks later, I received the phone call that changed everything. "Olivia, honey, we need to talk." Mom's voice was strained, tired, in a way that made me immediately concerned. "Can you come over tonight after dinner?" I arrived to find both parents sitting at the kitchen table with folders of papers spread between them. Bank statements, loan applications, and what looked like insurance documents created a paper landscape of financial stress. "Sit down, sweetheart," Dad said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "We need to ask you for something, and it's not easy for us." I sat down, already dreading what was coming next.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "The wedding costs have gotten away from us," Mom began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even with the overtime and Dad's consulting work, even with the loan we qualified for, we're still short." "How short?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dad cleared his throat. $25,000. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $25,000 was more than half my annual salary at the nonprofit where I worked as a program coordinator. It represented 2 years of careful saving, countless evenings of meal prep instead of eating out, and every tax refund I'd managed to sock away since college. "We know it's a lot to ask," Mom continued quickly, "but you're the only one who might be able to help. You've always been so responsible with money, so good at saving, and we promise we'll pay you back as soon as we can." I stared at them, these two people who had raised me, who had taught me the value of hard work and fiscal responsibility, asking me to bankrupt myself for Madison's fairy tale wedding. The irony was staggering. "What if I can't afford it?" I asked quietly. "What if giving you $25,000 would wipe out my emergency fund and leave me with nothing?" Dad's face fell. "Oh, Livy, we would never ask if we had any other choice. But Madison's already signed contracts, made deposits. If we back out now, we'll lose everything we've already paid and still owe cancellation fees." "Besides," Mom added, and I could hear her gearing up for the guilt trip, "think about how devastating this would be for Madison. Her wedding day ruined because her own family couldn't come together to support her. Think about how that would affect her marriage, her relationship with Trevor's family, her entire future." And there it was, the familiar refrain that had shaped every major decision in our family for decades. Madison's feelings, Madison's reputation, Madison's future took precedence over everything else, including my financial security. But as I sat there, watching my parents' desperate faces and feeling the weight of their expectation, I realized something they didn't know, something that was about to change this entire situation in ways none of us could have predicted. I owned Rosewood Manor. I hadn't told anyone about Rosewood Manor, not even my closest friends. The property had come to me through my late Grandma Catherine, my father's mother, in a way that had surprised everyone in the family. Growing up, Grandma Catherine had always seemed like the practical one, the woman who darned socks and grew her own vegetables, not someone who secretly owned one of the city's most prestigious venues. The story began when I was 12 years old. While Madison spent her summers at expensive camps and beach vacations with friends, I had volunteered to help Grandma Catherine with what she called her little project. She'd recently purchased a rundown Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, claiming she wanted a hobby to keep her busy in retirement. What she hadn't mentioned to the rest of the family was that this wasn't just any old house. The property sat on 15 acres of pristine land, with mature oak trees, rolling hills, and a natural spring that fed into a series of decorative ponds. The mansion itself was an architectural masterpiece from 1889, complete with hand-carved moldings, stained glass windows, and a grand staircase that curved elegantly through 3 floors. Grandma Catherine had bought it for a fraction of its potential value because the previous owners had let it fall into serious disrepair. The roof leaked, the plumbing was from the 1920s, and most of the rooms hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. But she had vision, and more importantly, she had patience. Every weekend that summer, and for the next 6 years, I spent my time at the mansion helping with the restoration. While other teenagers were at the mall or hanging out at the beach, I was learning how to strip wallpaper, refinish hardwood floors, and carefully restore original fixtures. Grandma Catherine taught me about architecture, design, and the satisfaction that comes from bringing something beautiful back to life. "Olivia," she'd say while we worked side by side painting window trim, "most people see what is, but we need to see what could be. This old house has stories to tell, and we're helping it find its voice again." Madison visited exactly once during those 6 years. She complained about the dust, the lack of air conditioning, and the fact that there was no cell phone reception in most of the house. She lasted approximately 2 hours before calling our parents to pick her up early, claiming she'd developed an allergic reaction to something in the old building. But I fell in love with the place. Every weekend revealed new discoveries, hidden passages between rooms, a dumbwaiter that still functioned, and a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a rolling ladder. As the restoration progressed, Grandma Catherine began sharing her real vision for the property. She'd been researching the mansion's history and learned that it had originally been built as a wedding gift from a railroad baron to his daughter. In its heyday, it had hosted elaborate parties, charity galas, and society weddings that were featured in newspapers across the region. "I think we should honor that history," she told me one afternoon as we stood in the completely renovated ballroom. "This place was meant for celebrations, for bringing people together during the most important moments of their lives." By the time I turned 18, Rosewood Manor had been transformed into something that belonged in architectural magazines. Grandma Catherine had spared no expense on the restoration, using only period-appropriate materials and techniques. She'd hired master craftsmen to repair the intricate plasterwork, commissioned stained glass artists to recreate missing window panels, and worked with landscape designers to create gardens that complemented the mansion's Victorian heritage. The business side of things developed gradually. At first, Grandma Catherine occasionally allowed historical societies to use the property for fundraising events. Then came requests from wealthy families looking for unique venues for milestone celebrations. Word spread through social circles about this hidden gem that offered both historical significance and modern amenities. Grandma Catherine was meticulous about maintaining the property's exclusivity. She limited bookings to ensure each event felt special, charged premium rates that reflected the venue's uniqueness, and personally approved every function to ensure it aligned with the mansion's dignified atmosphere. By the time I graduated college, Rosewood Manor had a 2-year waiting list and had become the most sought-after venue in the region.
During my college years, I continued helping with the business during breaks and summers. I learned about event planning, vendor coordination, and client relations. Grandma Catherine taught me the financial side of running a luxury venue, from insurance requirements to staff management to the delicate art of pricing exclusive services. The secret, she explained one evening as we reviewed booking contracts, is understanding that people aren't just paying for a location. They're paying for an experience, for the feeling that their special day is truly unique. Every detail matters, from the moment they walk through the front door to the last dance of the evening. What our family didn't know was that Grandma Catherine had been quietly building a substantial business. She'd kept the financial details private, partly because she didn't want relatives suddenly becoming interested in her little project, and partly because she enjoyed having something that was entirely her own creation. Madison had never shown any interest in the property, beyond occasionally mentioning that it might make a nice backdrop for her social media photos. Our parents assumed it was a harmless hobby that kept Grandma Catherine busy, not realizing that their mother had created one of the most successful event venues in the state.
When Grandma Catherine passed away 3 years ago, her will contained surprises that stunned everyone. She'd left modest but meaningful gifts to various family members, antique jewelry for the women, her husband's watch collection for the men, and small financial bequests that reflected her thoughtfulness. But Rosewood Manor, along with its business operations and all related assets, came to me. The reading of the will took place in her attorney's office, with the entire family present. When the lawyer announced that I was inheriting the property and business, the room fell completely silent. To my granddaughter Olivia, the attorney read from Grandma Catherine's carefully drafted document, who understood from the beginning that Rosewood Manor was more than just a building. She saw its potential, worked to restore its beauty, and learned to appreciate the joy that comes from creating perfect moments for others. I trust her to continue this legacy with the same care and vision that brought the property back to life. Madison's face had gone through several expressions during the reading, starting with surprise, moving through confusion, and settling on something that looked suspiciously like calculation. "Wait," she'd interrupted, "are you saying that Olivia inherited an entire mansion? What's it worth?" The attorney had smiled diplomatically and explained that property valuations were private matters, but I could see the wheels turning in Madison's head. At the time, I don't think she fully grasped the financial implications of what I'd inherited. Our parents had been genuinely happy for me, though I could tell they were also somewhat bewildered. They'd always seen me as the practical, responsible daughter who would probably end up with a nice, middle-class life working for some worthy organization. The idea that I'd suddenly become a property owner and business operator was outside their understanding of who I was supposed to be. In the 3 years since inheriting Rosewood Manor, I'd worked hard to maintain and grow the business while keeping my day job at the nonprofit. The venue booked itself well in advance, with couples often reserving dates 2 or 3 years ahead of their actual weddings. The revenue was substantial enough that I could have quit my nonprofit work, but I enjoyed the mission-driven aspect of my day job and wasn't ready to give it up entirely. I'd also been incredibly discreet about the financial success of the venue. While people knew I'd inherited the property, I'd never discussed the business side with family or friends. This wasn't entirely intentional secrecy, more a combination of privacy and the fact that no one had really asked for details. Madison certainly hadn't asked. In the 3 years since Grandma Catherine's death, she'd mentioned the manor exactly twice. Once to suggest I should let her use it for an engagement party she was planning for a friend, and once to ask if I thought it would make a good location for her Instagram photos. She'd never shown any curiosity about how I was managing the property or whether running a venue was challenging. This lack of interest had worked in my favor when Madison started planning her wedding at Rosewood Manor. She'd approached the venue as any other client would, working with my event coordinator, Sarah Matthews, a competent woman I'd hired 2 years ago to handle day-to-day client interactions while I maintained my nonprofit job. Sarah had followed standard procedures with Madison's booking, which meant treating her exactly like any other potential client. Credit check, deposit requirements, contract negotiations, and payment schedules had all proceeded normally. Madison had never mentioned that the venue owner was her sister, and Sarah had no reason to make that connection, since we had different last names and Madison had never been involved with the property. The irony was exquisite. Madison had chosen Rosewood Manor precisely because it was exclusive, expensive, and would impress everyone she wanted to impress. She'd bragged to our parents about securing a booking at the most prestigious venue in town, not realizing that her ability to get a reservation had nothing to do with her charm or connections. When Madison had called to share the news about booking Rosewood Manor, I'd managed to maintain my composure while internally marveling at the situation. She'd described the venue to me as if I'd never seen it, explaining how gorgeous the gardens were and how the ballroom was like something from a fairy tale. "You should see this place, Olivia," she'd gushed during one of her wedding planning calls. "It's absolutely magical. I can't believe I managed to get a booking. They're usually reserved years in advance, but they had a cancellation and I convinced them to let me have the date. I think they could tell how much it meant to me." I'd made appropriate admiring noises while thinking about Sarah's notes from Madison's initial consultation. According to Sarah's report, Madison had been demanding, condescending, and had tried to negotiate prices as if she were doing the venue a favor by choosing them. She'd also insisted on several contract modifications that went against standard policies, though Sarah had handled her diplomatically. What Madison didn't realize was that her booking was proceeding exactly like any other clients would. The special consideration she thought she'd received was actually just standard customer service. The payment schedule she agreed to was the same one offered to everyone else, and the prices she was paying were the regular rates, not some discounted family deal. Now, sitting in my parents' kitchen while they begged me to contribute $25,000 to Madison's wedding, I found myself in a position I'd never anticipated. They were asking me to sacrifice my financial security to pay for an event that was taking place at a venue I owned, for a sister who had no idea that her wedding was essentially happening at my house. The complexity of the situation was staggering. If I revealed that I owned Rosewood Manor, several things would happen simultaneously. Madison would realize that her exclusive venue booking wasn't actually exclusive at all. My parents would understand that they'd been asking me to pay for a wedding that was already generating revenue for me. And the entire family dynamic that had positioned me as the responsible but unremarkable sister would shift dramatically.
But there was more to consider. Madison had signed contracts and made deposits based on the assumption that she was dealing with an independent business. If I suddenly revealed my ownership and offered family discounts or special treatment, it could complicate the professional relationships I'd built with other clients. The reputation of Rosewood Manor depended partly on its consistency and exclusivity. On the other hand, watching my parents stress themselves into financial ruin for Madison's wedding when I had the power to solve the entire problem felt increasingly uncomfortable. They were taking on debt and sacrificing their retirement security for something that could be resolved with a simple conversation. As I sat there, listening to my parents explain their financial predicament and feeling the weight of their expectation that I would solve Madison's problems yet again, I realized that this situation represented everything that had been wrong with our family dynamics for decades. But this time, I held all the cards, and it was time to decide how to play them. The week after my parents asked me for $25,000, I found myself paying closer attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Small comments, subtle changes in behavior, and financial decisions that suddenly made more sense when viewed through the lens of desperate people trying to fund an impossible dream. It started with my mother's shopping habits. During our weekly grocery runs together, a tradition we'd maintained since I moved back to town after college, I noticed she'd begun buying exclusively generic brands, not just for some items, but for everything. The woman who had always insisted on name-brand coffee was now purchasing store-brand instant. She'd switched from fresh produce to frozen vegetables, and I caught her carefully comparing prices on items she'd never given a second thought to before. "Mom, you know you don't have to buy the cheapest version of everything," I mentioned as she agonized over whether to purchase the 99-cent pasta sauce or splurge on the $1.19 option. She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, you know me. I've always been frugal. Besides, most of these store brands taste exactly the same as the expensive ones." This was categorically untrue. My mother had never been particularly price-conscious, and I'd heard her complain about store-brand products countless times over the years. But pointing this out would only make her defensive, so I let it slide, while mentally adding it to my growing list of concerning observations. The financial stress was affecting my father differently. He'd always been somewhat absent-minded, but lately his distraction had reached new levels. During family dinners, he'd drift off mid-conversation, staring into space with a worried expression that he'd quickly mask when someone asked if he was all right. His phone buzzed constantly with what I assumed were work emails, but I noticed he always checked them with a slightly panicked expression, as if expecting bad news. One evening, I arrived early for Sunday dinner and found him in his home office, surrounded by paperwork and calculator tape. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him muttering numbers under his breath. 45 for the venue, 12 for catering upgrades, 8 for flowers, 6 for photography. His voice trailed off, followed by the sound of calculator buttons being pressed aggressively. Jesus Christ, how did this get so out of hand? I knocked gently on the doorframe. "Dad, is everything okay?" He looked up, startled, and quickly shuffled the papers into a pile. "Oh, Livy, yes, everything's fine. Just reviewing some work projects." But I'd caught a glimpse of the papers before he covered them, and they definitely weren't work-related. I saw Madison's name at the top of several documents, along with vendor invoices and payment schedules that made my stomach clench with sympathy for my parents' situation. The most telling sign, however, came from Madison herself.
She'd always been generous with expensive gifts when she was happy, the kind of person who celebrated good news by treating everyone around her to elaborate dinners or surprise presents. But lately, her gift giving had taken on an almost manic quality that seemed designed to prove how well everything was going. 2 weeks after my parents had asked me for my financial help, Madison showed up at my apartment with a bottle of champagne that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. "What's the occasion?" I asked, accepting the bottle and noting that it was still in its gift box from an upscale wine shop downtown. "Do I need an occasion to celebrate my amazing sister?" she replied, but there was something brittle in her enthusiasm. Besides, Trevor got a bonus at work and I wanted to share the good news. She'd mentioned Trevor's bonus casually, as if it were a minor detail, but I caught the way her eyes lit up when she said it. This was clearly significant news in their household, probably because they desperately needed the extra income to cover wedding expenses. As we opened the champagne, Madison launched into an update on her wedding planning that felt more like a performance than a conversation. Every detail was perfect, every vendor was amazing, and everything was proceeding exactly as planned. She spoke quickly, barely pausing for breath, and I noticed she kept checking her phone as if expecting important updates. "The dress fittings are going wonderfully," she gushed, taking a large sip of champagne. "The designer says it's one of the most beautiful gowns she's ever created. And the final menu tasting is next week. Trevor and I are so excited to finalize everything." "How's the planning process been for Trevor?" I asked, curious about how my future brother-in-law was handling the pressure. Madison's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, you know how men are about wedding planning. They don't really care about the details as long as everything looks nice. Trevor's been letting me handle most of the arrangements."
This seemed odd, given that Trevor would presumably be paying for a significant portion of these arrangements, but Madison quickly changed the subject to her honeymoon plans, which sounded equally expensive and elaborate. It wasn't until she left that evening that I realized what had been bothering me about our conversation. Madison had talked extensively about wedding vendors, dress designers, and menu selections, but she hadn't mentioned anything about payments, contracts, or the financial logistics of pulling off such an elaborate event. For someone who usually complained about every minor expense, this seemed like a significant oversight. The next warning sign came from an unexpected source, Trevor himself. I ran into him at the farmer's market the following Saturday, looking stressed and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the early morning hour. "Olivia, good to see you," he said, though his greeting lacked its usual warmth. "How are things going?" "I'm well, thanks. How are you holding up with all the wedding craziness?" Trevor's laugh was hollow. "Oh, it's a lot. More than I expected, honestly." He seemed like he wanted to say more, so I waited, pretending to examine the organic tomatoes while he gathered his thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, lowering his voice. "Madison mentioned that you're helping out financially with some of the wedding expenses. I wanted to thank you for that, and also to say that if it's putting any strain on you, we could probably scale some things back." My heart sank. Not only were my parents using me as their financial backup plan, but they'd apparently told Madison and Trevor that I'd already agreed to contribute, putting pressure on everyone involved. "What exactly did Madison tell you about my contribution?" I asked carefully. Trevor looked uncomfortable. "Just that you were helping cover some of the costs that were higher than your parents initially budgeted for. She said it was really generous of you, especially since you're always so careful with money." The picture was becoming clearer. My parents had apparently told Madison that I'd agreed to help, allowing her to continue with her elaborate plans while they scrambled to figure out how to actually pay for everything. Meanwhile, Trevor was operating under the assumption that the financial issues were resolved, when in reality, my parents were still desperately hoping I'd come through with the money they'd promised. "Trevor," I said gently, "I think there might be some miscommunication about the financial arrangements. You might want to have a direct conversation with Madison and both sets of parents about who's paying for what." He nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. Some of the numbers don't seem to add up, and when I ask specific questions, everyone gets vague about the details."
After Trevor left, I spent the rest of my morning walk thinking about the web of financial deception that seemed to be growing around Madison's wedding. My parents had committed to expenses they couldn't afford, then told Madison I would cover the shortfall without actually confirming this with me. Madison had continued adding expensive elements to her wedding based on the assumption that money was no longer an issue. And Trevor was caught in the middle, sensing that something was wrong, but not having enough information to address it directly. The situation reached a new level of absurdity the following week when I received a call from Sarah, my event coordinator at Rosewood Manor. "Olivia, I wanted to give you a heads up about the Carter wedding in October," she said, referring to Madison by Trevor's last name, which she'd be taking after the marriage. "The bride has been requesting some last-minute additions that are pretty significant." "What kind of additions?" "She wants to upgrade the floral arrangements to include some rare orchids that would need to be specially ordered. She's also asking about adding a second photographer and extending the reception by 2 hours with additional catering. The total for the upgrades would be around $8,000. I felt a headache forming. Did she mention how she plans to pay for these additions? "That's the thing," Sarah said, sounding puzzled. "When I explained the costs, she said to go ahead and add everything to the final bill, that her family would take care of it. But according to our records, they're already at their credit limit for changes, and the final payment is due in 6 weeks." Madison was still adding expenses to a wedding that my parents couldn't afford, apparently confident that the money would somehow materialize. Either she genuinely believed I'd agreed to pay for everything, or she was operating under some other financial assumption that wasn't based in reality. "Sarah, please don't approve any additional changes with written confirmation and a deposit. And if there are any issues with payments, let me know immediately." After hanging up, I realized that the situation was spiraling beyond what anyone had anticipated. Madison's wedding had become a runaway train of expenses, with multiple people making assumptions about who would ultimately pay for everything. My parents were drowning in debt they couldn't service. Madison was continuing to add costs she couldn't cover, and Trevor was growing increasingly suspicious that something was seriously wrong. Meanwhile, I sat in the middle of it all, the only person who knew that the entire crisis could be resolved with a single revelation about who actually owned the venue where Madison had chosen to hold her dream wedding. But revealing my ownership would expose not just a financial deception, but the deeper family dynamics that had allowed this situation to develop in the first place. It would force everyone to confront the reality that Madison's needs had been prioritized to such an extent that our parents were willing to sacrifice their financial security, and that they'd assumed I would do the same. The question was no longer whether I would tell them the truth, but when and how I would do it, and whether our family would survive the revelation intact. As I sat in my apartment that evening, looking out at the city lights and thinking about Grandma Catherine's careful restoration of Rosewood Manor, I realized that she'd given me more than just a property and a business. She'd given me the power to either rescue my family from their financial crisis or teach them a lesson about assumptions, manipulation, and the true cost of always putting Madison's desires first. The wedding was now 6 weeks away, and time was running out for everyone involved. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I received 3 phone calls within an hour that painted a devastating picture of just how desperate my family's situation had become.
The first call was from my bank. "Miss Carter, this is Rebecca from First National. I'm calling because we've had several inquiries about your account from someone claiming to be your father. He was asking about your savings balance and whether you'd be making any large withdrawals soon." My blood ran cold. What exactly did he want to know? He said he was helping you with some financial planning and needed to verify your liquid assets. Of course, we couldn't provide any information without your written authorization, but I wanted to make you aware of the inquiry. I thanked Rebecca and hung up, my hands shaking slightly. My father had tried to access information about my bank account, which meant he was either verifying that I actually had the $25,000 he'd asked for, or he was exploring other options for accessing my money without my consent. The second call came from my credit card company with a similar story. Someone had called claiming to be me, asking about my credit limit and available balance.
When they couldn't verify the proper security information, the call had been flagged as suspicious. But it was the third call that revealed the true extent of the crisis. Sarah from Rosewood Manor sounded genuinely concerned when she reached me. "Olivia, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a serious problem with the Carter wedding. The bride's mother called this morning in tears, saying they might need to cancel everything. Apparently, their financing has fallen through." "What did she tell you exactly?" "She said that a family member who had promised to help with the costs has changed their mind, and they don't have the money to cover the final payment. She was asking about our cancellation policy and whether they'd lose their entire deposit." Elizabeth Carter was my mother, though Sarah didn't know that. And the family member who had supposedly changed their mind was me, even though I'd never actually agreed to help in the first place. "Sarah, what's our standard procedure for this situation?" "Well, according to their contract, the final payment is due 4 weeks before the event. If they can't pay, they forfeit their deposit and any money already paid to vendors. But honestly, Olivia, I felt terrible for the woman. She sounded absolutely devastated." I told Sarah I'd call her back and immediately drove to my parents' house. I found my mother in the kitchen, still in her work clothes, crying over a cup of tea that had gone cold. When she saw me, she tried to compose herself, but the facade crumbled almost immediately. "Oh, Olivia, thank God you're here. Everything is falling apart." "Mom, what's going on? And don't tell me everything's fine, because I know it's not." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and took a shaky breath. "Your father lost his contract yesterday. The company he was working with had budget cuts, and they terminated all their external consultants effective immediately. We were counting on that income to help cover the wedding expenses." This explained the desperate calls to my bank and credit card company. With their backup income gone, my parents had probably spent the day trying to figure out how to access money they didn't have. "Where's Dad now?" "He's meeting with the bank about extending our home equity line of credit. But Olivia, we're already borrowed against this house to the maximum amount they'll allow. I don't think they're going to approve any additional loans." I sat down across from her, feeling the weight of the situation settling around us. "Mom, help me understand something. When you asked me for $25,000 last week, did you tell Madison that I'd already agreed to help?" She looked uncomfortable. We might have implied that you were on board with contributing to the wedding." "And did you tell the vendors at Rosewood Manor that the money was secured?" Her face crumpled. "We had to, Olivia. Madison had already signed contracts and made commitments. If we'd told everyone we couldn't pay, the whole wedding would have been canceled weeks ago." "So you've been operating under the assumption that I would give you the money without actually getting my confirmation first?" "We knew you'd come through," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You always do. You're so responsible, so good at managing money. We hoped." "Mom, did it occur to you that I might not have $25,000 just sitting around? That asking me for that much money might put me in financial jeopardy too?" She looked genuinely surprised by the question. "But you inherited that property from Grandma Catherine. Surely that's worth quite a bit of money." And there it was, the assumption that had been driving everything. My parents believed that inheriting Rosewood Manor meant I had access to substantial liquid assets, not understanding that property ownership and cash flow were entirely different things. They'd built their entire financial strategy around the idea that I could easily access large amounts of money because I owned real estate. "Mom, owning property doesn't mean I have cash available. The house requires maintenance, insurance, taxes. It's not like I can just pull money out of it whenever I want." This was technically true, even though I wasn't mentioning the revenue from the venue business. But I needed to understand how deep this misunderstanding went before deciding how to proceed. Before she could respond, my father came through the front door, looking like he'd aged 5 years in a single afternoon. When he saw me sitting with my mother, his shoulders sagged with what might have been relief or resignation. "How did the bank meeting go?" He sat down heavily in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "They turned us down, said we're already overextended and they can't approve any additional credit. The loan officer suggested we consider bankruptcy counseling." I sat down across from her, feeling the weight of the situation settling around us. "Mom, help me understand something. When you asked me for $25,000 last week, Did you tell Madison that I'd already agreed to help? She looked uncomfortable. We might have implied that you were on board with contributing to the wedding. And did you tell the vendors at Rosewood Manor that the money was secured? Her face crumpled. We had to, Olivia. Madison had already signed contracts and made commitments. If we'd told everyone we couldn't pay, the whole wedding would have been canceled weeks ago. So you've been operating under the assumption that I would give you the money without actually getting my confirmation first? We knew you'd come through, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. You always do. You're so responsible, so good at managing money. We hoped? Mom, did it occur to you that I might not have $25,000 just sitting around? That asking me for that much money might put me in financial jeopardy too? She looked genuinely surprised by the question. But you inherited that property from Grandma Catherine. Surely that's worth quite a bit of money. And there it was, the assumption that had been driving everything. My parents believed that inheriting Rosewood Manor meant I had access to substantial liquid assets, not understanding that property ownership and cash flow were entirely different things. They'd built their entire financial strategy around the idea that I could easily access large amounts of money because I owned real estate. Mom, owning property doesn't mean I have cash available. The house requires maintenance, insurance, taxes. It's not like I can just pull money out of it whenever I want. This was technically true, even though I wasn't mentioning the revenue from the venue business. But I needed to understand how deep this misunderstanding went before deciding how to proceed. Before she could respond, my father came through the front door, looking like he'd aged 5 years in a single afternoon. When he saw me sitting with my mother, his shoulders sagged with what might have been relief or resignation. How did the bank meeting go? He sat down heavily in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. They turned us down, said we're already overextended and they can't approve any additional credit. The loan officer suggested we consider bankruptcy counseling.
The word bankruptcy hung in the air like a physical presence. My parents, who had worked their entire lives to build financial stability, were facing the possibility of losing everything because they'd committed to paying for a wedding they couldn't afford. Tom, my mother said quietly, we have to tell Madison. We can't keep pretending this is going to work out. Tell her what? He replied, his voice hollow. That we've destroyed our financial security for one day? That we might lose the house because we promised her a fairy tale wedding? How do we explain that to her? And Trevor, I added, thinking about my conversation with him at the farmer's market. He's already suspicious that something's wrong. This is going to destroy their marriage before it even starts. My father looked up at me with desperate eyes. Olivia, I know we asked for a lot, but is there any way you could help us? Even if it's not the full amount, anything would be better than having to cancel everything. I studied both of my parents, these people who had raised me, who were now drowning in debt because they'd prioritized Madison's wants over their own financial survival. The irony was almost unbearable. They were begging me to save them from a crisis that existed only because they didn't know I owned the venue where the wedding was taking place. Before I answer that, I said carefully, I need to ask you something. Have either of you ever wondered how Madison managed to book Rosewood Manor? It's supposed to have a multi-year waiting list. They looked at each other, confused by the apparent change of subject. She said they had a cancellation, my mother replied. She said she convinced them to let her have the date because of how much it meant to her. And you believed that story? Why wouldn't we? My father asked. Madison can be very persuasive when she wants something. I pulled out my phone and opened the email app, scrolling through messages from Sarah about various venue bookings and administrative matters. The subject lines clearly identified me as the owner of Rosewood Manor events, with emails about contracts, vendor payments, and client communications. There's something I need to tell you both, I said, turning the phone so they could see the screen. Something that's going to change how you think about this entire situation. They leaned forward, squinting at the small text, and I watched their expressions change as they began to understand what they were seeing. Olivia, my mother said slowly, why are you getting emails about Rosewood Manor business operations? Because I own Rosewood Manor. The silence that followed was deafening.
My parents stared at me as if I'd just announced that I was secretly married to a celebrity or had won the lottery without telling anyone. You, what? My father stammered. Grandma Catherine didn't just leave me a historic property. She left me a business. Rosewood Manor is one of the most successful event venues in the state. I've been running it for 3 years. My mother's face went through several expressions before settling on something between shock and calculation. But it means Madison booked her wedding at my venue. It means you've been asking me to pay for an event that's taking place at a property I own. It means this entire financial crisis could have been avoided with a simple conversation. My father stood up abruptly and started pacing around the kitchen. Jesus Christ, Olivia, do you realize what this means? We've been killing ourselves trying to pay for a wedding that you could have given Madison as a gift. I could have, I agreed, but nobody asked me. Instead, you assumed I would give you $25,000 in cash, while Madison went ahead and booked the most expensive venue in town without knowing her sister owned it. The implications were sinking in now. My mother looked like she was going to be sick. Madison doesn't know, does she? She asked quietly. Madison has no idea. She's been working with my event coordinator, following all the standard procedures for booking and payments. As far as she knows, she's just another client who managed to secure a prestigious venue. But the money, my father said, still pacing, the payments she's made, the deposits, have all gone to my business. Madison has been paying me for her own wedding without realizing it. The absurdity of the situation was finally becoming clear to all of us. Madison had chosen Rosewood Manor specifically because it was exclusive and expensive, wanting to impress everyone with her ability to secure such a prestigious venue. Meanwhile, she'd been unknowingly paying her own sister for the privilege, while our parents had been begging me to contribute money to an event that was already generating revenue for me. What happens now? My mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
That, I said, depends on what you want to happen and what Madison wants to happen, because in 4 weeks, she's going to show up at my venue for her wedding, and at some point, she's going to find out who really owns the place. The question was whether that revelation would come as a happy surprise or a devastating betrayal, and whether our family would ever be the same again. The three of us sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I could see my parents processing the revelation, their minds racing through all the implications and missed opportunities. Finally, my mother spoke. Olivia, I need to understand something. If you own the venue, why didn't you tell us when Madison first mentioned booking it? Why did you let us go through all this financial stress? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since this whole situation began. Honestly, Mom, at first I was curious to see how it would play out. Madison has always gotten everything she wanted from this family, and for once, I wanted to see what would happen if she had to navigate something on her own. But we're your parents, my father said, his voice strained. When you saw us struggling, when you knew we were destroying our financial future, why didn't you step in? Because, I said, feeling years of frustration bubbling to the surface, nobody asked me what I thought about Madison's wedding plans. Nobody consulted me about the budget or the venue choice. You all just assumed I would fall in line and contribute money when you needed it, just like I always have. My mother looked uncomfortable. That's not fair, Olivia. We've always appreciated. Have you? I interrupted. Because from where I sit, it feels like Madison gets celebrated for her wants, while I get taken for granted for my sacrifices. She demands a $45,000 venue, and everyone scrambles to make it happen. I build a successful business, and nobody even asks how it's going. The truth was finally coming out, all the resentment I'd been carrying about our family dynamics for years. My parents exchanged glances, and I could see them recognizing patterns they'd probably never noticed before. You're right, my father said quietly. We did take you for granted. We assumed you'd help because you always do, because you're capable and responsible, and he trailed off, seeming to realize how that sounded. Because Madison's happiness matters more than my financial security?
No, my mother said quickly, then paused. Well, maybe, not intentionally, but yes. I think we've always prioritized Madison's needs because she seemed to need more support, more attention. You were always so independent. Being independent doesn't mean I don't deserve consideration. It doesn't mean my feelings don't matter or that I should automatically sacrifice my own interests for Madison's benefit. We sat with that truth for a moment before my father asked the practical question that was weighing on everyone's minds. So, what do we do now? Madison's wedding is 4 weeks away. Trevor's family is expecting a celebration. All the vendors have been booked and paid deposits. How do we handle this? I'd been thinking about this question since the moment I revealed my ownership of Rosewood Manor. There were several possible approaches, each with different consequences for our family relationships and Madison's wedding. I see 3 options, I said, pulling out a notepad to organize my thoughts. Option 1. I reveal everything to Madison immediately. I tell her I own the venue, explain that her wedding costs are actually payments to me, and offer to host the wedding as my gift to her. That sounds generous, my mother said hopefully. It does, I agree, but think about the implications. Madison chose Rosewood Manor specifically because it was exclusive and expensive. Part of her excitement about the wedding comes from the prestige of the venue. If she finds out her sister owns it, that exclusivity disappears. Instead of feeling like she secured something special, she'll feel like she was given charity. My father nodded slowly. And knowing Madison, she won't be grateful. She'll be humiliated. Exactly. She'll feel like everyone at the wedding knows she's getting family assistance instead of paying her own way. It could ruin the entire experience for her. What's option 2? My mother asked. Option 2. I continue letting Madison believe she's paying for an independent venue, but I quietly reduce the costs to something you can actually afford. I absorb the difference as my contribution to the wedding, but I don't tell anyone about it. This option appealed to my parents' immediate need for financial relief, but it had its own complications. The problem with option 2, I continued, is that it still involves deception. Madison continues thinking she's paying full price for an exclusive venue, you continue pretending you can afford it, and I become complicit in maintaining a lie. Plus, it doesn't address the underlying family dynamics that created this mess in the first place. And option 3, my father asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. Option 3. I let everything proceed exactly as it is. Madison pays the full amount for her wedding at my venue. You find a way to cover the costs you've committed to, and everyone learns the truth after the wedding is over. The silence that greeted this suggestion was heavy with implications. Olivia, my mother said carefully, if we don't get financial help from you, we'll have to cancel the wedding. We literally don't have the money to pay the final invoice. Or, I said, you could have an honest conversation with Madison about scaling back the wedding to something you can actually afford.
4 weeks before the wedding? My father asked incredulously. After she sent out invitations and made all these plans? That would devastate her. Maybe, or maybe it would teach her something important about financial reality and making decisions within your means. I could see my parents struggling with this concept. They'd spent Madison's entire life protecting her from disappointing consequences, and the idea of letting her experience the natural results of overspending was genuinely difficult for them to consider. There is a 4th option, I said, after giving them time to process, but it's probably the most complicated one. They looked at me expectantly. I could tell Madison the truth about owning the venue, but position it as a recent discovery rather than something I've known all along. I could say that I just found out she booked her wedding at my property, and now I want to work with the family to figure out the best way to handle it. You mean lie about when you found out? My mother asked. I mean, spare everyone the embarrassment of admitting how long this miscommunication has been going on. Madison gets to keep some dignity, you don't have to admit you committed to expenses you couldn't afford, and we can all work together to find a solution that works for everyone. This option felt like the most diplomatic approach, but it also felt like enabling the same patterns that had created the problem in the first place. The question is, I said,
Do we want to solve this immediate crisis, or do we want to address the deeper issues in how our family handles money and decision-making? My father rubbed his temples. Honestly, Olivia, right now, I just want to get through Madison's wedding without declaring bankruptcy or destroying her marriage before it starts. I understand that, but I need you both to understand something. If I help solve this problem, I'm not going to continue being the family bank account. I'm not going to keep bailing everyone out when Madison's desires exceed your budget. That's fair, my mother said quickly. More than fair. And I want both of you to think seriously about why you've been willing to sacrifice your financial security for one day of celebration, because Madison will probably want an expensive baby shower, and then expensive birthday parties for her kids, and then help buying a house, and on and on. When does it end? The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. It didn't end. Madison would continue expecting financial support for her various life events, and my parents would continue providing it until they had nothing left to give. Maybe this crisis is actually an opportunity, I suggested, a chance to establish new boundaries about money and family contributions. How so? My father asked. Well, instead of me just solving the problem with money, what if we approach this as a family business decision? Madison's wedding is taking place at my venue, which makes me a stakeholder in its success. Rather than me giving you cash to pay my own business, what if we structure this as a partnership? I was thinking out loud now, trying to find a solution that addressed both the immediate crisis and the long-term family dynamics. Madison could work with me after the wedding to help promote Rosewood Manor. She's got great social media skills and a flair for event planning. Instead of this being charity, it could be a legitimate business arrangement that benefits everyone. You'd hire Madison? My mother asked. I'd consider it. The venue business could use help with marketing and social media management. Madison's wedding could serve as both her special day and a showcase for what Rosewood Manor can do. She gets her dream wedding, I get business promotion, and you don't go bankrupt. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it felt like a way forward that preserved everyone's dignity while addressing the practical problems we were facing. But, I added, this only works if Madison is willing to acknowledge that she's receiving family help instead of paying market rates. And it only works if you both commit to having honest conversations about money in the future. My parents looked at each other, and I could see them communicating in the wordless way that couples develop over decades of marriage. What do you think? My mother asked my father. I think, he said slowly, that we need to talk to Madison, tonight, before this gets any more complicated. Are you ready for that conversation? I asked. Because once we tell her the truth, there's no going back. Our family dynamics are going to change permanently. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, my mother said quietly. Maybe it's time for some changes. I looked at both of my parents, these people who had shaped my understanding of family loyalty and responsibility, and realized that we were all about to learn something new about ourselves and each other. All right then, I said, standing up and grabbing my car keys. Let's go tell Madison that her sister owns the venue for her dream wedding, and let's see how she handles that news. Madison and Trevor's apartment was a reflection of their financial priorities. Expensive furniture that didn't quite fit the space, designer accessories mixed with budget household items, and a general atmosphere of trying to project success while living paycheck to paycheck. When Madison answered the door and saw all three of us standing there, her smile faltered. "This is unexpected," she said, stepping aside to let us in. "Is everything okay? You all look so serious." Trevor emerged from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel, and his expression immediately mirrored Madison's concern. "Hey everyone, what's going on?" "We need to have a family conversation," our father said, his voice carrying the weight of everything we'd discussed earlier. About the wedding, about money, and about some things that have come to light recently. Madison gestured toward their living room, and we all arranged ourselves on furniture that was clearly chosen for appearance rather than comfort. The awkwardness was palpable, and I could see Trevor and Madison exchanging worried glances. "Before we start," I said, "I want both of you to know that nobody is in trouble, and Madison's wedding is not being canceled. But there are some things you need to know about the financial arrangements and about Rosewood Manor specifically. Madison's eyes narrowed slightly. What about Rosewood Manor? I signed all the contracts months ago. Please don't tell me there's some problem with the venue. There's no problem with the venue, our mother said carefully, but there is something unusual about the situation that we all just discovered ourselves. Trevor leaned forward, his business instincts clearly activated. Unusual how? I took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would change our family permanently. Madison, do you remember when Grandma Catherine died and left me that old Victorian mansion? Of course, Madison replied, looking confused by the apparent change of subject. You inherited that big house that she'd been fixing up. It was really generous of her, considering how much that property must be worth. What exactly do you think I did with that property? Madison shrugged. I assumed you were living in it, or maybe renting it out for some extra income. You never really talked about it much. I didn't just inherit a house, Madison. I inherited a business. Grandma Catherine had turned that Victorian mansion into one of the most successful wedding venues in the state. The silence that followed was profound. I watched Madison's face as she processed this information, seeing confusion give way to understanding, and understanding give way to something that looked like horror. Wait, she said slowly, are you saying that the house Grandma Catherine left you is a wedding venue? I'm saying that the house Grandma Catherine left me is Rosewood Manor. Trevor was the first to grasp the full implications. Oh my God, he said, running his hands through his hair. Madison, do you realize what this means? But Madison wasn't ready to face what it meant. She was still stuck on the basic facts. That's impossible. Rosewood Manor is this exclusive, expensive venue. It's been featured in magazines. There's a waiting list. It's not just some old house that somebody fixed up. Actually, I said gently, that's exactly what it is. Grandma Catherine bought a deteriorating Victorian mansion in 1985 and spent 20 years carefully restoring it. She turned it into Rosewood Manor, and when she died, she left the entire operation to me. Madison stood up abruptly and started pacing around the small living room. But I booked my wedding there. I went through all the proper channels. I worked with their event coordinator. I paid my deposits. You worked with Sarah Matthews, my event coordinator. You paid deposits to my business. You've been planning your wedding at your sister's venue without knowing it. The color drained from Madison's face as the reality sank in. Does this mean, have I been paying you for my own wedding? Technically, yes, though you were paying my business, not me personally, and you were treated exactly like any other client. Trevor stood up and joined Madison in her pacing. This is insane. Madison, do you understand what this means for our finances? For all the stress we've been under trying to afford this wedding? Madison whirled around to face our parents. Did you know about this? When you said Olivia was going to help with the costs, did you know she owned the venue? Our father cleared his throat uncomfortably. We found out about an hour ago. Olivia just told us. And you came straight here without discussing it with me first? Madison's voice was rising, and I could see her working herself up to one of her dramatic outbursts. You all had this huge conversation about my wedding without including me? Madison, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. We came here to include you. We're here now to figure out how to handle this situation together. Handle it, she repeated, her voice cracking. How do you handle finding out that your entire wedding is basically charity? That everyone who attends is going to know that my sister gave me the venue because I couldn't afford it myself?
That's not, our mother started to say, but Madison cut her off. Of course it is. Don't you see? Everyone's going to think I only got Rosewood Manor because of family connections. All those people I bragged to about booking the most exclusive venue in town are going to find out that it's my sister's business. It's humiliating. Trevor sat back down, looking exhausted. Madison, maybe we should focus on the practical aspects of this. If Olivia owns the venue, then we can work out some kind of family arrangement that doesn't put your parents in financial jeopardy.
What kind of arrangement? Madison asked suspiciously. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the chance to propose the business partnership solution I'd discussed with our parents. I've been thinking about that, I said. What if, instead of this being a charity or a family discount, we structure it as a legitimate business arrangement? Your wedding could serve as a showcase for Rosewood Manor, and you could work with me afterward to help promote the venue. Madison stopped pacing and stared at me. You want to hire me? I want to explore the possibility. The venue business could use help with social media marketing and event coordination. You have great aesthetic sense and you understand what brides are looking for. This could be an opportunity for both of us. But what about the money we've already paid? Trevor asked, his practical nature taking over. What about the balance that's due in a few weeks? I looked at our parents, then back at Madison and Trevor. Here's what I'm proposing. Madison's wedding proceeds as planned, with all the details she's already arranged. Instead of paying the final balance to my business, Madison agrees to work with me for 6 months after the wedding to promote Rosewood Manor and help develop our social media presence. You're offering to trade wedding costs for work? Madison asked, sounding skeptical. I'm offering to create a partnership where everyone benefits. You get your dream wedding without your parents going into debt. I get professional help growing my business. Mom and Dad get relief from financial stress. And Trevor gets to start his marriage without crushing debt. Trevor was nodding thoughtfully, but Madison still looked conflicted. What would people think, she asked, when they find out that I'm working for the venue where I had my wedding? They'll think you're a smart businesswoman who parlayed her wedding planning experience into a career opportunity, I said, which would actually be true. Our mother leaned forward. Madison, honey, this solves all the problems we've been worrying about. You get to keep your wedding plans, we don't go bankrupt, and you get a job opportunity with your sister. But it changes everything, Madison said, and for the first time in the conversation, she sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than angry. I thought I was planning this amazing, independent wedding that Trevor and I were paying for ourselves. Now it turns out that my family has been involved the whole time, and I need help from my sister to make it work. Madison, I said gently, you were never paying for this wedding yourselves. Mom and Dad have been taking on debt they can't afford to cover most of the costs. Trevor's family has been contributing. This was always a family effort. Trevor nodded reluctantly. She's right, Madison. We've both known that our parents were stretching their budgets to help us. This just makes it more transparent. Madison sat down heavily, looking deflated. I just wanted one thing that was completely mine, completely special. I wanted to feel like we'd achieved something amazing together. You have achieved something amazing, our father said quietly. You planned a beautiful wedding that's going to create wonderful memories for everyone who attends. The fact that family is helping you make it happen doesn't diminish that achievement. Besides, I added, if you decide to work with me after the wedding, you'll have the opportunity to create something amazing for other couples too. You could help other brides have the same magical experience you're planning for yourself. Madison looked around the room at all of us, and I could see her processing not just the immediate situation, but the larger implications for our family relationships. Can I think about it? She asked finally. This is a lot to absorb, and I need some time to figure out how I feel about everything. Of course, I said, but Madison, the wedding is happening regardless. Whether you decide to work with me afterward or not, your wedding day is going to be everything you planned. That part doesn't change. Trevor reached over and took Madison's hand. Whatever you decide about the job thing, I think we should be grateful that there's a solution that doesn't involve canceling the wedding or your parents taking on more debt. Madison nodded slowly, and I could see her beginning to accept that this unexpected revelation might actually be a gift rather than a disaster. There's one more thing, I said. If you do decide to work with me, I want it to be a real job with real responsibilities and real compensation. This isn't charity disguised as employment, it's a genuine business opportunity. What kind of compensation? Madison asked, her practical side finally emerging. We'd work out salary and benefits based on the scope of your responsibilities. But Madison, this could be the start of a real career in event planning if you're interested in pursuing it. For the first time since we'd arrived, Madison smiled. Not her usual brilliant attention-seeking smile, but something smaller and more genuine. I need to think about all of this, she said again. But thank you, Olivia, for the offer and for not letting Mom and Dad ruin their finances for my wedding. Thank you for being open to a solution that's different from what you originally planned. As we prepared to leave, Trevor walked us to the door. This is going to work out, he said quietly. Madison just needs some time to adjust her expectations, but I think she's actually excited about the possibility of working with you. I hope so, I replied. I think we could actually make a good team. As we drove home, our parents were quiet, processing everything that had just happened. Do you think she'll take the job? Our mother asked finally. I think, our father said, that Madison is smarter than we sometimes give her credit for. She'll realize that this is an opportunity, not just a bailout. And if she doesn't? I asked.
Then she gets her dream wedding anyway, and we all learn something about family boundaries and financial responsibility. It wasn't the ending any of us had expected when this whole situation began, but it felt like the beginning of something healthier for our family. Madison called me 3 days later, just as I was finishing up a site visit with potential clients who were considering Rosewood Manor for their anniversary celebration. Her voice sounded different, less dramatic, more thoughtful than I'd heard in years. Olivia, I've been thinking about everything we discussed. Can we meet for coffee, just the two of us? We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, neutral territory, where we could have an honest conversation without the weight of family dynamics pressing down on us. When I arrived, Madison was already there, looking uncharacteristically subdued in jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual carefully curated outfits. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down. "I owe you an apology, and I owe you some honesty about things I've never admitted before." This was not the Madison I was expecting. The sister I knew led with demands and drama, not apologies and introspection. "I've been thinking about what you said, about family patterns and financial responsibility," she continued, "and I realized that I've never actually managed a major expense entirely on my own. The car, the apartment deposit, even my college expenses, there was always family money involved." "Madison," "No, let me finish. I need to say this." She took a shaky breath. "When I booked Rosewood Manor, I knew it was more than Trevor and I could afford. I knew our parents couldn't really cover the difference. But I told myself that somehow it would work out, that the money would come from somewhere." "From me, you mean?" "From you," she agreed quietly. "I've spent my whole life assuming that if I wanted something badly enough, the family would find a way to make it happen, usually through your sacrifices." The admission hung between us, finally naming the dynamic that had shaped our relationship for decades. "I've been jealous of you," Madison continued, staring into her coffee cup. "Which sounds crazy, I know, because I'm the one who always got everything I wanted. But you built something real, something that belongs entirely to you. The venue, your business, your independence, you earned all of that. Madison, you could build something real too. You have talents, you have vision." "That's why I want to take the job," she interrupted. "Not because I need charity or because it's convenient, but because I want to learn how to create something meaningful the way you did." Relief flooded through me, though I tried not to show it. "Are you sure? Because this would be real work, with real expectations and accountability." "I'm sure, but I have some conditions." Of course she did. This was still Madison, after all. "I want to start with a 3-month trial period, for both of us. If it's not working out, if I'm not adding real value to your business, then we end the arrangement with no hard feelings. And I want the wedding to proceed exactly as planned, no family discounts or special treatment that would make me feel like I'm accepting charity." "Madison, the wedding budget is already—" "I know what the real budget is now," she said firmly. "Trevor and I talked about it, and we're going to pay our portion directly to you. Mom and Dad can handle their contribution, but I want to pay something, even if it's not the full amount. I need to contribute to my own wedding." This was perhaps the most mature thing I'd ever heard Madison say. What did Trevor think about all this? Trevor was relieved, honestly. He's been worried about our finances for months, but didn't want to upset me by suggesting we scale back. Now he feels like we can start our marriage without crushing debt hanging over us. "And what about the business side? Do you have thoughts about how you'd want to approach marketing work?" Madison's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen since we were children planning elaborate games in our backyard.
Actually, yes. I've been researching wedding venues online, looking at how they present themselves on social media. Most of them are boring, just pretty pictures with no personality or story. What would you do differently? I'd focus on the experience, not just the aesthetics. Rosewood Manor has this incredible history, this story of Grandma Catherine's vision and your restoration work, but none of that comes through in your current marketing. She pulled out her phone and showed me several screenshots of wedding venue Instagram accounts. Look at these. They're all identical. Generic, romantic photos with inspirational quotes. They could be any venue anywhere. And your approach would be? Tell stories. Show the process of planning a wedding at Rosewood Manor, the behind-the-scenes work that makes each event special. Feature real couples and their unique celebrations. Make people feel like they're part of something meaningful, not just renting a pretty space. I found myself genuinely excited about her ideas. Madison had always been creative, but I'd never seen her apply that creativity to anything business-related. There's something else, she said, looking slightly embarrassed. I want to document my own wedding planning process, including this whole family revelation. Obviously with everyone's permission, but I think there's a story there about family businesses and unexpected connections. You want to use your wedding as content for the venue's marketing?
I want to use my wedding as an example of how the right venue can bring families together in unexpected ways. It's a unique angle that no other venue could duplicate. The irony was perfect. Madison's wedding, which had started as an exercise in exclusivity and status, could become a showcase for family connection and authentic celebration. What about the 3-month trial period? I asked. What happens if we decide to continue working together after that? Then we negotiate a real employment contract with salary, benefits, and clear expectations. I want this to be professional, Olivia. I don't want to be the sister you're helping out. I want to be a valuable employee you're glad to have hired. We spent the next hour outlining the practical details of our arrangement. Madison would start working with me the week after her honeymoon, beginning with a comprehensive review of our current marketing strategies. She'd have access to our booking system, vendor relationships, and client feedback to develop a complete picture of how the business operated. There's one more thing I want to address, Madison said as we prepared to leave. I want to apologize to you, formally, for years of taking your support for granted. I never thanked you properly for all the times you sacrificed for my benefit. Madison, we were kids. Family dynamics develop over time. We're not kids anymore, she said firmly. I'm 25 years old, and I've been operating like a teenager who expects her family to solve all her problems. That ends now. The wedding itself took place on a perfect October afternoon, with golden light streaming through the windows of Rosewood Manor's ballroom and the autumn gardens providing a spectacular backdrop for photographs. Madison looked radiant in her designer gown, but more importantly, she looked genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with expensive details or social media moments. During the reception, as I watched her dancing with Trevor while their guests celebrated around them, I felt a sense of closure about our family dynamics that I hadn't expected. The wedding wasn't just Madison's special day, it was a celebration of our family learning to function in healthier ways. Our parents, relieved of the crushing financial pressure they'd been under, were able to actually enjoy the celebration instead of worrying about bills. Trevor's family, unaware of the behind-the-scenes drama that had preceded the wedding, simply saw a beautiful venue hosting a joyful celebration. But the real victory was watching Madison interact with the venue staff and vendors with genuine appreciation instead of her usual entitled demands. She'd begun to understand the work that went into creating magical moments for others. 3 months later, Madison's trial period at Rosewood Manor concluded with her transition to a permanent position as marketing and social media manager. Her behind-the-scenes content strategy had already increased our booking inquiries by 30%, and her documentation of her own wedding planning process had been featured in a regional bridal magazine. More importantly, our family had found a new equilibrium. Madison still had expensive tastes and ambitious dreams, but she'd learned to pursue them through her own efforts rather than family bailouts. Our parents had established clearer boundaries about financial support, and I'd discovered that being appreciated for my contributions felt much better than being taken for granted.
The venue business continued to thrive, but now it felt like a true family legacy rather than just my individual achievement. Madison brought creative energy and fresh perspectives that I wouldn't have developed on my own, while I provided the business experience and financial stability that allowed her ideas to flourish. 6 months after the wedding, Madison called me with exciting news. A major wedding planning magazine wanted to feature Rosewood Manor in an article about family-owned venues, focusing on our story of discovering unexpected connections and building new traditions. "Can you believe it?" she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "They want to interview all of us about how families can work together in business without losing their personal relationships." "Are you ready for that level of publicity?" I asked. "I think so, but more importantly, I think our story might help other families who are struggling with similar dynamics. Maybe other people need to hear that it's possible to change established patterns and create healthier relationships." Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that Madison's expensive wedding had ultimately been the catalyst for positive changes that none of us could have anticipated. What started as a crisis born from poor communication and unrealistic expectations had evolved into a business partnership and family healing that benefited everyone involved. The most important lesson I learned was that sometimes the best way to help someone isn't to rescue them from consequences, but to offer them opportunities to grow from challenges. Madison's character development had come not from getting everything she wanted without effort, but from learning to contribute meaningfully to something larger than herself. Our family still wasn't perfect. We probably never would be. But we'd learned to communicate more honestly about money, expectations, and boundaries. We'd discovered that supporting each other didn't always mean saying yes to every request, and that real love sometimes meant allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices. And Rosewood Manor, Grandma Catherine's little project that had started as one woman's vision of creating beautiful spaces for celebration, had become something even more meaningful. A place where our own family had learned to celebrate not just special occasions, but the everyday miracle of people who love each other choosing to grow and change together. Madison's wedding had taught us all that the most valuable gifts aren't the ones that cost money, but the ones that cost courage. The courage to tell the truth, to set boundaries, to demand better from ourselves and each other, and to believe that families can change for the better when everyone is willing to do the work. That lesson was worth far more than $45,000. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.